Whether your beer is in a bottle, can, or glass, kick back and relax. It's Better on Draft.
Welcome, everybody. Episode 324 of the Better on Draft podcast. My name is Ken. Thank you so much for joining us. I truly appreciate it. We are back after being off for a week, and we are excited as we have one of my favorite breweries to introduce. But first, let's go over all the hosts. We have Wendy. Wendy, what are you drinking over there?
I am drinking one of my go-tos, the Alaskan Husky IPA.
And Dan, what do you got over there?
Going hard with this Rochester Mills Peanut Butter Cup Milkshake Stout.
We definitely bought many cases of those beers when you were in town last week for or 2 weeks ago for the Loaded Dice Show. We do have a guest host today. Rob, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and, of course, what you're drinking.
Hi, I'm Rob. I live in Indianapolis, which is a surprisingly underrated but great beer city. And I am drinking a wonderful Taxman brew, the Peach Brandy Barrel Exemption.
And for myself, I am drinking the Alaskan Amber, and I am swinging it down with the Alaskan Pilsner. Enjoying both. So our guest in studio today, all the way from Juneau, Alaska, we have Marcy and Geoff Larson. Why don't you guys introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and, of course, what you're drinking tonight.
I'll go first. I'm Marcy Larson, married to this guy who came up with the great idea to start a brewery a bazillion years ago and made it work. And he's been a great business partner and fun guy and super great chef on top of being a good brewer. So I get to do a lot of the pickup work. I do the paperwork. I keep him organized and on track. So that's pretty much my role. And happy to be here.
Yeah, and well, I was fortunate enough to meet Marcy in Montana as I was trying to hitchhike to Alaska. Didn't make it the first time, but she was doing the books at the Glacier National Park in the evening, and I'd cook her breakfast at 4 a.m. I was the shorter to cook, and I went back to get my degree in chemical engineering, and lo and behold, she got to Alaska before me, and I had to follow her. I didn't take the hint. I had to move from the East Coast to Alaska, to the disappointment of every single man in a small town called Gustavus, Alaska. I wasn't really very well accepted at the time when I arrived. She was one of only 2 single women in the town. So they say the odds are good for women in Alaska, but the goods are yeah, the odds are good, but the goods are odd.
Well, I want to start off, as a lot of people who listen to this show know, you guys make my favorite style of beer, which is an alt beer. Alt style ale that you guys currently make, which is your Alaskan Amber. What was the theory behind putting all your eggs behind the Alaskan Amber? Like, why an amber and not a lager? I know it was a couple decades ago that you started, so IPAs weren't necessarily crazy, but why necessarily an amber or an alt style ale?
You're making me thirsty. I have to pour a beer. I'm sorry.
Go for it.
It's the amber. Yes, go for it.
When we were looking at the platform of being able to sit there and talk about beer and try to make people understand what the unique characters of beer can give an individual as far as flavor. One of the things that we knew we wanted to do is talk a little bit about the history of brewing in Alaska, because brewing has been historically significant anywhere in the world. The thing though that was interesting is when we did the research to be able to put a lot of the memorabilia about the brewing scene in Alaska, obviously way before Prohibition, turn of the century, we found a lot of information. And Marcy was an avid collector of threads of information and advertising materials, and we ended up finding a collector who had a lot of very pertinent information.
It was pure accidental, but the way it all worked out is the amber is actually based off of a Gold Rush era recipe from the Douglas City Brewing Company, which is just the island across from Juneau here. So it made sense. It was a local brew come alive again. We were able to homebrew as close to it as we thought was the brew that they did back then, which had some unique characters to it. But it tasted awesome. And it was like, well, why not do something historical and good? That it has double whammy for us.
So the recreation of Alaskan Amber really has to do with a throwback of what was maybe being consumed 100 years ago. Obviously, we didn't have the yeast of 100 years ago, but there were interviews of the brewers' challenges that came to light. And one of them is the fact that it was a very cold environment here in Alaska. And even though the only yeasts available here were the ale yeasts, it was a cold fermentation that really has kind of dominated the approach we had to making this beer. And alt, obviously, is the German word for old. The old way of making ales, cooler fermentation, that really was the lead-in to this beer, coupled with the fact that the brewer was from the old world, and he was getting his hops from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, keep in mind, this is pre-war World War I. I'm not into history to the point where I can really give you the nuts and bolts of it, but what we ended up having to do is find these hops at the time called Bohemian hops, which now are Saaz. And we were buying these hops from, at the time when we started in 1986, from the Czechoslovakian Iron Curtain venue. And even though that sounds really complicated, I can't imagine what the brewer did back in 1907 to get hops from that area to the last frontier. But you asked about the Alaskan Amber. That really is many things that we like to embrace. One, colder fermentation. That's a much more subtle expression of the yeast. It exemplifies maybe some of the more subtle characters of malt. And then the rarity of the hops back turn of the century meant that the brewer was using them only to balance the malty characters. So really the amber has much more of a malt kind of presence, but the image on the label is of, I don't know if you can see it, it's of a fisherman.
Fishing boat.
It's a fishing boat. You got it. And, you know, in many ways, I would say that really kind of epitomizes a little bit of that crazy frontier spirit. What the hell were you thinking starting a brewery in Alaska? Well, I think that's the bit of what we embrace. We're dominated by where we live, and that has made us do what we do. And the amber is one of those examples.
Well, my follow-up question is a little bit more into the beer and the style, because amber sells, but alt beer doesn't. So I guess, what was the choice of calling it an amber, and why do you think even in 2023 that we still fear using the names like alt or ESB or something else like that?
That's a good, that's a good consumer question for sure. Because we had a wonderful ESB that we loved, that we produced back when it won a lot of awards. But you're right, people were scared of a bitter, scared of ESB, and that kind of just vanished on us. It was a bummer.
Yeah.
Naming it the amber though was, I don't think we really thought about it that much, to be quite honest. We just were putting out back in those days. The choices were pretty limited. There were less than 100 breweries, so we didn't have a lot of choices of different styles. And you just wanted to relate to people who craft brew wasn't even a thing. It was just, what are you making and how can you describe it?
Can you have that's a really interesting question, because I would answer it in like almost a two-dimensional way. Not to say it's simple, but the dimensions of the past, when we started in 1986, the craft brew scene was at its infancy. There wasn't really a lot of awareness, and our consumers in Alaska really had, maybe in some ways, some more cosmopolitan characteristics, because we always had to travel. But at the same time, we were a little bit more homegrown. So style specificity in the early days, the vanguards of like the Michael Jacksons of the world and the like that wrote about beer, not with the sequin glove, but with the golden pen. Really, when you talked about those type of stylistic specificities, it went over a lot of people's heads. And I think at the time, really what we wanted people to do is accept the beer for it and not tell people what they were going to taste. Let them make their own designation. Now, fast forward, when I say 2 dimensions, I don't mean in Euclidean geometry terms of just 2 dimensions, X and Y. I'm referring to today, when we start looking at stylistic designations, there's an attempt to use them to inform the consumer. But let's face it, when you start talking about black IPAs, you're talking about the oxymoron of oxymorons. These black IPAs are using American hops. They're not from India, and they're not pale. And by gum, I bet you there's a black IPA lager. And at the end of the day, I think the idea of descriptors has morphed a bit to try to help people guide them into the flavor journey that we all embrace and love. But I think it's different now. And with the variety and spectrum of flavors that are out there, really in some ways, we sometimes will cloud the real issue of enjoying a beer because it happens to appeal to you personally with maybe way too much specificity. The monikers, the classic styles, those are great guideposts because they're classic because they survived the tests of time. But today, it's just a set of vocabulary type terms to help the consumer navigate the way of their own personal hedonistic pleasure.
That makes sense.
No. You're speechless. Ken, this is crazy. What the heck?
No,
And usually there's lots of jabber, and I there was dead air there.
It's one of those times, Geoff. I tell you what, and a lot of people have seen it on this show, when I'm very enamored with what the guest is saying, that I'm just lost in your words, that I'm not thinking to respond. I'm just listening to what you're saying because you have a lot of great insight. But that was the few questions that I wanted to ask before I pass it off to Wendy. So Wendy, good luck. What do you got for Geoff?
So I have a million questions, actually. I got the opportunity to visit your brewery back in 2019 when I was on a cruise.
Wow.
I actually thought it was really funny because during my research, there was a video that you guys had, and you were talking about what it was like to be in Alaska and where you are. And one of the people said, well, you got to like the rain. It rains a lot here. And it did. It poured the entire time I was in Juneau. But we really enjoyed visiting your brewery. Actually, so much so that I kind of use it as a baseline to when I am evaluating other breweries that I visit. I know that we will have a lot of questions about sustainability and the innovative things that you guys have done to succeed as you have where you're at. But one of the things that I don't think a lot of people realize is how much of a charitable giving program you guys have at Alaskan. So I just kind of wanted to ask about that and ask, how important is it to you as a business owner to have that impact, not just in your community, but pretty much anywhere you can get your beer?
Well, that's kind of, that started because we're in Alaska, and Alaskans just do that. I mean, we're small enough that we're able to help out our neighbor. We're able to, if there's a boat at all in distress or adrift, we go get it. Alaskans do kind of rally and look for each other all the time. So it's kind of a way. It's a way of life, really.
Yeah, it's a mindset.
It's a mindset. Giving has always been really something that we always intended to do. In the early days, we were like a sneeze away from going bankrupt. So, that you couldn't do too much, but you could always give effort, even if you couldn't give monetarily. And so we've just kind of built the brewery around that. Our brew crew, if you were at the brewery, then our brew crew, everybody, even in the tasting room, the tip jar is dedicated to a nonprofit. Nobody keeps their tips. All the tips go into that tip jar, and that goes to a nonprofit that the crew vote on each year to nominate one specific nonprofit that receives all of those tips. We do other things too, but that one gets all of the tip jar, which is kind of fun. and that generated from everybody who works here. It wasn't our idea, it was everybody. So, I mean, it really is kind of a way of life for us. I mean, over in the Midwest, we're doing stuff all the time with various charities, and we have donation pages. And I mean, there is a lot of need, unfortunately. There's a whole lot of need. So wherever we can help that makes sense, we don't, unfortunately, even though we're very family oriented, we don't donate to kids stuff because of our alcohol bent. And so that's something we promised the folks at the alcohol awareness group up here that we wouldn't do. So we stay out of young underage stuff, but adult stuff, the Husky, you had the Husky there. We do pints for paws and ales for tails and all kinds of stuff with that.
Yeah.
And,
But, you know, Marcy, you hit on something that's interesting. And I think, and I would say it's in other places, but maybe less obvious. But there are certain things that, you know, in Fairbanks, Alaska, and when it gets to be really cold, it's a crime to pass somebody who's hitchhiking because it's so cold, that person is in distress.
Right.
And even though that kind of clouds the intent of altruism and the like, but I would have to say when I first moved up to Alaska, I was following Marcy, went into that small little town, and there were only 90 people in the town. And not that everyone got along. In fact, there was probably some really divisive issues, whether they be personal or whatever. Or political or religious, doesn't matter. But when we would have a gathering, everybody was invited. I mean, and so this is a town of 90 people. And so somebody would host this gathering of 90 people. And lo and behold, if somebody did not show up, somebody in the gathering would be tasked to stop by their cabin
and make sure they were okay. So
because this town was remote. So this is before cell phones. This is before communication linkages. Somebody really had to stop by the cabin just to make sure that they weren't hurt. That's, I think, again, that kind of epitomizes that feeling of intimacy and community that gets driven home all the time. So when we start talking about that sort of feeling towards others, you know, I know that's pervasive in many different enclaves, but I'd say it's especially prevalent here in the largest state of the union with, if not the smallest, one of the smallest populations.
if that answers your question.
It does. So, why Alaska?
Oh my God.
We love the outdoors.
Yeah.
We love the adventure. We're both from the East Coast, and in between college years, we're spending our summers working out west at national parks because we love outdoors, and it was a job that paid enough to pay the college bill back then. So, and I actually was the one who saw pictures of Glacier Bay over here near Gustavus, which is where Geoff is referring to, which is very close to Juneau. And I just went, whoa, we got to go check this out. So I came up and worked a summer, fell totally in love with the outdoors. And that's kind of what gets you. If you like the outdoors, the scenery here is breathtaking. It's dynamic. There is so much going on. I mean, right here in our little town, you know, here of 30,000 in Juneau, we're on the salt water, but we're right by glaciers. We're right by we're right in the midst of a rainforest.
We have the fifth largest ice field in North America. So you can heli-ski any day of the year. You can ice climb, you can go fishing. There's so much here. But you know, that's one thing that I have to admit, when I left friends and family down in the lower 48 to come up here, there was many years where they would ask, you know, well, when are you going to come back? When are you going to be over this phase? Those are terminologies they use.
Our parents would say, when is this phase over?
Yeah. But the thing is that I would have to say that there's no question beauty is that first hook of interest, that again, appeal of the natural wonders, the awe-inspiring vistas and experiences. But when it came down to it, I would also say that there was a shared vibe with the people that also are here for the same reason, because there's definitely reasons to leave, whether it be the rain or lack of family that
Or
you
lack of
left behind.
sunshine in the
Or-
wintertime.
Right. But I would have to say that shared appreciation, and then also I'd say a fair amount of the fact that you are leaving maybe sometimes lots of your friends and family behind, opens your own psyche to accepting new friends and new family. And I'd say that's what really was amazing, is that after about 5 years, I didn't talk about the whales and the bears and the beautiful northern lights as much as I talked about the people.
And the people are genuinely nice, and they're also crazy as heck. So they're not boring.
Wackos sometimes.
They're multi-talented. Usually they do more than 2 or 3 things. And I mean, every time I turn around, it's like, wow, you can do that too. So it's a pretty amazing place. We love the people and love it up here. And I think we're gonna stay.
Gustavus is a small town, so I had to move to Juneau, and I'm getting thirsty.
So he's gonna pop the Juneau juice. I don't know if you guys have some Juneau juice.
I'm gonna have a Juneau juice.
I have one of those to drink next. It's delicious. I love it. So I ask about that because I have found that when people ask me about my favorite place to visit, I always say, if you can go to Alaska, go, because it was so amazing. I can't wait to go back. And one of the things that I noticed on your website is that there is a Drink Alaskan Travel Juneau sweepstakes that is still open right now. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can. That's a program that we're running in conjunction with the Juneau travel industry folks that are inviting people to come up and enter in this sweepstakes to showcase what Juneau has to offer. And so they approached us and asked if we would do a program to promote Juneau and invite people to come take part in this incredible getaway adventure, which has some amazing things on it. The only thing is it's illegal in Michigan. We can't run that program there. You guys have really crazy laws in Michigan, so sorry about that. But outside, other states can, and we are running it in a number of states where you enter to win, and it's in a drawing kind of a thing. But some folks are going to get some really cool adventures.
Yes, I was looking at all of the stuff that they can do, and I'm like, oh man, that's like half the stuff I wanted to do, and I only had like 3 days, so I didn't get to do all of it. I'm like, oh, I got to go back.
There you go.
So I want to go back a little bit to touch on some of the things that you guys have done to focus on, or kind of not focus, work around some of the challenges that you guys have being in a landlocked situation. And I had seen an article where you had said, we live outside of the box, so we have to think outside of the box, or something along those lines. What is that mentality done to help with facing those challenges?
Well, I could give 2 examples, one of which that probably is fairly well known, is we were the first craft brewery to capture our CO2 from fermentation and purify it and use it within operations. Carbon dioxide is a very important gas that's used to purge out bottles, cans, kegs of air, tanks, so that you can make the beer and not have it oxidize, and you can extend its life. But carbon dioxide typically comes from burning fossil fuels and then purifying the carbon dioxide so that it can be used for food grade applications. But here in Alaska, we were off the beaten path. So it's interesting that sometimes, like I said before, our location really inspired us to think differently, because we couldn't just call up and have somebody come in with a tanker of carbon dioxide and deliver it like they would in any other place that's connected to the road system. We're not connected to the road system. So,
as you know,
so the challenges that created also made us think, okay, what else can we do? And so That's an example of what we ended up doing very, very early on in our history. We started collecting all the carbon dioxide from fermentation. And obviously the barley malt that creates the food and sugars for yeast fermentation is actually from the carbon dioxide from the air, not from sequestered carbon sources like fossil fuels. And I think that's an obvious one that we had. But again, I think it's interesting because those challenges are analogous to many challenges that people have in their daily lives. I don't care whether it be the type of apparel you wear in a very wet environment. It's not your typical cotton stuff. You want to look good, but you also want to feel good. But guess what? That means you change the way you approach to your environment. That's the same thing we did with carbon dioxide. But let me go really geeky on you. I don't know if you can take it. Cut me off if I do. But
bring it on, Geoff.
Okay. Well.
Okay.
Okay. Here we go. The deep dive. You know, that pervasive thinking differently really, I think, epitomizes all of us. But it really, I think, hits home and gets emphasized. And one example I would give is our lab group, who, you know, they're doing all the microbiology of operations and stuff. There's one compound that we all despised. And I'm a chemical engineer, so I read lots of material handling data sheets. And this material that was used in the laboratory only to suppress yeast growth so that you can get an idea of maybe other microbes that are out there. It's called actadione, and it is awful. Our crew just, it's like, God, we got to find something different. So we ended up proposing to the American Society of Brewing Chemists, a different compound. A compound that's called nystatin, but it's used for yeast infections, for human consumption. It's a compound that is consumed by humans, and it does the same thing as actadione. And we started doing the research, and we proposed to the American Society of Brewing Chemists an alternative. And after about 2 sessions, we ended up getting a focus group. We had a number of collaborative large breweries participate. And now it's an accepted process that the American Society of Brewing Chemists allows to be used as a standard to replace this obnoxious compound. Well, we thought outside the box, but we all do that all the time. When you're thinking that way, you all of a sudden, okay, this is the standard, but is there something that we can do better? And at the end of the day, the American Society of Brewing Chemists accepted it. The European Brewing Congress adopted it, and the Japanese Brewing Congress adopted it. We impacted the entire world's lab safety because we thought differently.
So that's kind of cool.
That's crazy. we're a tiny little brewery in Juneau, Alaska, drinking Juneau juice once in a while. But man, oh man, it's that juice. It's that creativity. It's that actual thinking differently that I think I get reminded of what makes life here in the last frontier so cool.
That is awesome. I have a million more questions that I could ask, but I know my co-host also have some questions they'd like to ask. So I'm going to pass it over to Rob.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a very selfish question and lead it with, I've got a very good friend. He used to be my neighbor, but had to move, who lived in Juneau, grew up in Juneau, was sad that he ended up living in Indiana, and always talks about, you know, his time in Juneau. And he actually was just back there until last week. Anyway, he had the same question. He has always brought me Alaskan beer when he comes back. You do not distribute to Indiana yet. Is it coming anytime soon? Right now I have to go to Michigan or Ohio.
Yeah. We are in Ohio. We did make it that far.
You are in Ohio. That's an easy drive for me.
So 25 states. We're in 25. We're halfway. We're slowly making our way across. But you know, we ran into COVID, and we ran into freight rates, and we ran into supply chain stuff. that the freight prices just went through the roof. And so you don't want to pay that much for our beer. And we don't want to charge you that much for our beer. So we are waiting a little bit to let those freight rates go back down, which we think they will. It's not going to be a forever thing. And it's already starting to get better than what it was. So we'll be working back on that again as we go forward. But that definitely knocked us for a loop. That took a little bit of a punch and just added too much of a price tag on there.
Okay. That's good to hear.
Stay tuned. Yes.
I've waited this long, so that's good to hear.
Who knows? It may be by drone delivery. We'll have to see.
That's right. So one of the things I quite enjoy when he comes back is he spends actually a lot of time in your brewery with his mom, and but he would always talk about the crew brews that he tried that time, and he always brings whatever pilot beers he can bring back. And so how is that system working? Like, are these beers getting tried and promoted, or how does that work?
I can talk a little bit about that because I think it's really cool because I'm not a brewer. I'm the one who, does paperwork and picks up after everybody and stuff and does that end of it, but I don't actually brew. But I always want to brew, I always want to, try little things and stuff. And at the brewery, anybody who works here is allowed to play on our 1-barrel system. So we have a little 1-barrel system here. In fact, it's right behind us here. And you just have to match up with a brewer who knows what they're doing. And then you collaborate and you come up with whatever recipe you want to come up with and you brew it. And then I would say probably 50% of those go down the drain, but 50% maybe go in our break room. And in our break room, our crew samples and makes notes and stuff. And we have something called a shifty. At the end of every shift, we get a beer. And so that's our shifty. And if your brew is a popular shifty, then you have to, in order for it to continue, you have to go back and do it again. So it isn't a one-off wonder. It's got to be repeatable. So if you can repeat it and it still is popular, then it goes into the tasting room for the consumer to sample, where your friend got the chance to have it
as a crew brew.
As a crew brew. And there it gets public opinion outside the brewery and from all different folks, and it gets evaluated. And yes, a lot of those brews do end up either in our pilot series or in our limited releases, and sometimes in our full-time. That's how Husky got there. Mm-hmm. That's how White was started. So there's a number of brews that came through that way. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing we do too is we have a 1-barrel system, a 10-barrel system. The 10-barrel is the one we started with. And that's the one we do the crew brews in. After you do it twice, then you scale it up to a 10-barrel. And then that goes around for the public. And then if it's good enough through that, then it goes to our 100-barrel system. So we have the 3 different systems.
Yeah.
And we didn't buy them in the right order.
No.
We started with a 10-barrel system, and then we got the 100-barrel system, and then we were doing all our play brews on 10 barrels. It's really tough to dump 50% of your 10-barrel brews. So the 1-barrel was a good idea.
But that's it. I think also kind of gives everyone a grounding in the focus on flavor, focus on the process, and the teams are not just necessarily focused from one department. There really is a cross-departmental approach, and so obviously it's, as we all know, there are some glory hounds in the worlds of any particular discipline, but the glory hounds are important, but all the support behind those glory hounds really account for way more than 50%, way more than 75% of the real work. Yeah. The old adage, 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. So everyone knowing what's involved, finally to get the end product consistently is kind of the little bit of the icing on the cake of that whole process. But the real meat of the cake is the fact that we can put out beers that we really feel good about and tested and vetted when they get out to the consumer.
That reminds me a lot of New Glarus, another husband and wife team brewery, where all of their employees get trained to be tasters of the product, and they get to try it at the different stages and all that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we have taste panels that we run at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we rotate through it. And it's fun. It's really amazing. You learn a lot, but you can't drink coffee until 10 and that or after the taste panel, and that's really a detriment sometimes.
So I'm thinking back to a couple of the beers I've had brought back for me that have been wonderful, and you've used interesting ingredients like spruce tips and birch syrup and alderwood, well, especially the smoked alderwood. Do you have any other local flavors you're looking at, or things that I maybe not have gotten to try yet?
Oh boy, yes. And but you hit on some, I think, really neat, iconic signature product raw materials that we really enjoy the story. So like for the spruce tip, I'll just kind of digress. I'm not going to answer your question directly, which is my prerogative, not necessarily what you want to hear. But Captain Cook in 1778 on his second voyage looking for the Northwest Passage, which now does exist, regrettably, but he was looking for it, but he was well known as a brewer on board. But as importantly, he was well known for the health of his crew, because he really did search out local foods to augment the seafaring larders that were, basically salted meat and no vegetables, no fruits. He searched out the local ingredients. But he was also known as a great brewer on board. And one of the local ingredients they used in brewing was spruce. And he was not always successful in making great beers, probably much like our brewing. Sometimes here we have to dump a few. But he used spruce, and he made 14 references in his journals having to do with making beer with spruce. Sometimes spruce boughs, but he said specifically the new growth spruce was especially appealing to his crew. And I'd have to say that historical significance is grounded in real scientific significance, because we did some oil fractioning studies and found that the noble hops of the brewing world had specific fractions that were identical to the fractioning of spruce tips. Most people think of spruce as a pitchy, piney kind of like evergreen, which it is, but the new growth is the new sap runnings. Much like whether it be maple syrup or birch syrup, that new runnings is high in sugar and actually has a very low component of some of those terpenes and the like. As it grows older, it does get that turpentine-like character. But really what it has is a real almost berry-like, fruit-like character. Citrusy. It's beautiful. And he used it. And so we tried to sit there and kind of really take the inspiration of the past as a way of expressing today what was appealing to people centuries ago. You know what? There isn't that much difference with the same products that could be appealed to those taste sensibilities of today. So anyway, that was a little bit of a departure. Sorry about going off on that.
But we're using spruce in a whole bunch of different ways that we never thought we would. So right. I mean, we're hoping we can turn it almost into a small cottage industry of its own, which would be really awesome and support the folks out in the rural communities that are picking and processing these for us. Because it's a
renewable resource. We're the largest national forest in the United States, and basically we have that right there, and it's not doing anything but pruning the trees, which allows the spring essence to fortify the real core of that botanical. So it's not hurting the plant, it's actually maybe enhancing the plant, but at the same time creating something that's usable. But we've used other woods, red cedar, so that's the one that you didn't mention. You look at the use of woods in many products, whether it be oak in the making of certain beverages, or like you said, the alder, which is what we use traditionally as a hardwood that makes the dry environment for preserving meats and fish, smoked fish. We use the alder as a heat source to smoke some malt, but actually roast the malt. That's what makes smoked porter I think one of those first exposés of departing from the norm that we did back in 1988. Smoked beers weren't even on the horizon in the U.S. There were a few enclaves in Bamberg, Germany, and the smoked beers really made a lot of sense to us because the old brewers in Alaska had to roast their own grains. Porters were very, very prevalent in Alaska in the early 1900s, late 1800s. By that same time on the East Coast, the pale pilsners and lagers were taking over, but the West was a holdout. And so the idea of a dark beer was not unusual. And the idea of roasting grains to create that, quite frankly, all grains were directly associated with the heat source. And so when you think about back in 1900 in Juneau, Alaska, if you walk down any street, what did you smell? You smelled smoke.
Mhm.
Yeah. Everybody was heating their homes that way. Barbecue?
Wood
There was no
burning
such thing as barbecue in Juneau, Alaska in 1900. Everything was barbecued. Everything was cooked on wood. And guess what? A little bit of smoke in your porter was standard.
But we love it. It was a fun recreation to come back with that and be able to produce this. The smoked porter's been we just popped the bottle because we couldn't stand it. And,
But to your point, we go back to, and there's the thread that I like about our conversation is that it's all integrated in what we do is about where we're from, and what we are is dictated by the environment. And so being stewards of the environment is sometimes due to necessity, but sometimes it's due to your ethic allegiance to why we're here. We love where we live. It's absolutely gorgeous, but it's also real fragile. Our growing seasons are very small and short. And so when we've hiked in the Arctic, those footprints last a long time in the Arctic tundra, a lot longer than most other places. And it really gives you a sense of responsibility, awe, because when you make those footprints, no one else's are there, but also a sense of, oh my goodness, how do you preserve this? How do you nurture this? And how do you take care of it?
And the spruce tips has been a great example of having that is not hurting the trees at all, and it's helping growing seasons and everything. So it's definitely a renewable resource that's going to be, we hope, will be a good solid industry down the road.
Well,
We also
thank
have berries. The other thing is berries too.
Oh, yeah.
That's what we didn't mention, but we have berries, we have, plants, we have spruce tips, we have wood. There's a lot of things up here that we play around with.
Thanks. Well, thank you. I am going to let Dan get a question or two in.
All right, excellent. I'm going to go back to, just brewing in general in Juneau. I couldn't find the answer to this. Is all of your beer that's distributed made at your brewery, or is it contracted out?
Right here.
Everything that has Alaskan Brewing Company on it is made in Juneau, Alaska.
Excellent.
So, going back
go
to
ahead.
the Indiana question, that's really, it's all about transportation and that challenge. But yeah, sorry about that. Didn't mean to interrupt you, Dan.
No problem at all. Go ahead and tell us about the challenges you have with shipping. Like you mentioned, you're not connected to the roads where you're at. It's a really unique area. Talk to us about how you get this beer halfway across the country.
Yeah, well, I have to say when you talk about the dry, uninteresting reality of how do you make beer and then keep on making beer? How do you make it sustainable? There's a sustainability question in regards to the environment, but then there's a sustainability question that has to do with finances and economics. When we started, I'd have to say our banking relationship had those same questions. And at the time, what was interesting is that the second largest user of shipping services in the world, the second largest, was Heineken. Because Heineken was distributing all over the world, and the Heineken in the US at the time, not necessarily now, and I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but at the time came from Holland, and they were shipping all over the world. And by the way, the first largest user of shipping services was the US military. So, but the concept at the time too was that here is a novel product. Again, let's go back to that 1970, 1980 period. You know, craft beers weren't there. Imports were the unique flavor profiles that people searched out. And in 1986, 3% of all beer consumed in the U.S. was imports. 0.3% was craft. So that is a different era. But you know, you're looking at the fact that how do you create products that are unique and then get them to market? We were looking at the paradigm at the time of the major breweries weren't interested in having this huge bouquet of malts and hops and yeast profiles that we were striving for. So yes, the challenges of economics and transportation are huge.
So for us, you know, to back up just a little bit, yes, we're remote up here. There is no road in or out. The only way we get stuff is either by boat, as Wendy talked about, on coming in and out on the boat line, or which is barge for us, or by air. And air is super expensive. So it pretty much boils down to barge lines, traffic back and forth. And it's a 5-day voyage to go from here down to Seattle. So we get a barge once a week. And unlike our brethren in the lower 48, if we blow it, we're out for at least a week. You know? Yeah. So it made us have to really think about planning and think about, you know, preparing ahead, just as anybody up here in the last frontier does. But that's a unique character. The fortunate thing is that water is the least expensive mode of travel. It's less expensive than trucking, and less expensive, obviously, than air. So that's not the most expensive part of our journey, but it does add a factor on there, and it adds a timeline. And we were very concerned about quality too, because as it's going down on the barge, we have to keep that beer temperature controlled, which once again adds another cost on there, because you don't want it freezing and you don't want it baking either. So.
And then even to drill down, even in the shipping annals of you know, transportation costs, there's two modes of shipping. One is container ships, where you look at the connexes, the 40-foot boxes that are stacked up in every port in the U.S. That maybe people are aware of, maybe they aren't. They just look like the box on top of an 18-wheel trailer. But there's container ships that would put those in the hold, and then there's barges. And barges then have a much less expensive cost of transportation, albeit at a longer time of transport. So when you're even dealing with shipping, our transportation routing is less impactful as far as a carbon footprint, but that also means that we had to be very, very mindful on the longevity of our product, the stability. So it goes back to that CO2 recovery. Really, in many ways, you know, we've always focused on how do we maintain the quality of our product when we have these distance challenges. And so I think that also was one of those things that our environment where we lived focused our energies on, to making sure that we did things with that mindfulness, because we knew as we grew and we went further afield, we would be held to the same standard as anybody, whether it be down the street or in the next state or literally across the continent. So So yeah,
It's challenges.
our location kind of focused our efforts.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. One more question. I'm going to pass it back over to Ken. You opened your distillery back in 2019. Tell us what brought you to do that, and how are your RTDs doing? We tend to talk about the market shifting towards that type of drink. Are you seeing that, or just tell us about it in general?
Well, 2019, we did get a distilling operation along with the licensing. But of course, we know what happened in 2020, COVID, and everything kind of got weirded out. But in light of the fact that really this distillation is really another step that requires all the brewing operations up to that point. So for us, it made all the sense in the world to have that as one additional part of our beverage trade. We did have to sit there and think about, because we had, as part of our mission statement, producing internationally recognized craft beers, and we changed that to craft beverages. Because I would have to say that really the experiential, hedonistic part of our lives has to do with the food and liquid that we consume. And we're a beverage manufacturer. We have all the infrastructure and the like, and there are things that we can do that it was like, in some ways, maybe a little bit, the industry was telling us there are other beverages that you have expertise in. And so we're aware we have to adapt and change. Much like seasons change, so do we, and we adapt. So how are they doing? They're doing well. They're doing really well.
We just released them though.
Yeah.
They're new. We just got them out here in May of this year. So, and they're only in Alaska at this point. So we had a big learning curve, lots to learn. We weren't distillers when we started. We're learning a lot, and it's a good thing. It seems to be very popular.
But I'll weave in a couple threads here. We're in the flavor business. So my goodness. Oh my God.
That opens up a lot more flavor.
We have huge opportunities to express ourselves. So we tend to use less sugar by a long shot. I mean, we're 1/3 the bricks of most other RTDs. But we're using spruce. We're using things that are unique to maybe our DNA. And is it fully developed? No, we're not even into the adolescent phase of our distillation growth.
Well, you said you're a craft beverage maker, and the two things that I did not see, now, of course, we're not in Alaska and we're not there every day. I did not see any seltzers on your Untapped page. Have you guys made any seltzers or tried doing any alcoholic seltzers up there?
Actually, we have. It's kind of quiet, but not up here. We actually have seltzers here that we have been selling for before COVID. Actually, we released them right then. Actually, was it right about then?
I would say, well, it's been now like 4.5, 5 years. So yeah, 18. Yeah.
And that's something we're getting a lot of praise
2018.
for, is those seltzers. They're made with spruce, a lot of them with the spruce tips and stuff. So they're not as sweet, and people really love them. Up here, we outsell White Claw and Truly in the market. And people visiting have said, "Why can't I get these down south?"
Well, it's the proliferation of seltzers. There's just no space.
There's so many seltzers.
But Marcy mentioned the word sweet. I mean, our seltzers are zero carb, zero carb, but the sweetness is a flavor association with the spruce. So while we have a characteristic of being extraordinarily dry, as the seltzer typically is, there is a interesting flavor association having to do with the berry-like characters that are innate to, I think that's Spruce character, and it's really interesting. So I think that's one reason why we do so well. But yeah, and also I think to that question, let me take another step too, is we are also, we're playing with definitely the non-alcoholic sodas and the like. Again, we're focusing on low sugar, low carb, but it's all an exploration. It's all, living on living the life on the last frontier where we're kind of open to
Trying new things.
Yeah.
Well, as we're seeing the changes here in the landscape, what about non-alcoholic beers? There are a lot of breweries like Brooklyn. Obviously, we had Two Roots here in Michigan. Athletic exploded over since COVID started. Are you seeing a call for non-alcoholics up there? Non-alcoholic beers, beverages, other than even beer?
Not so much up here. We're typically behind, everybody else.
That's true. That's true.
So we'll see what happens. But we do get calls for it, but not a lot. And the trick is, we think anyway, is to be able to make the beer flavorful, and the quality of the flavor is what's important too. So to do it is what is a challenge.
Accolades to those who are doing it, but no, we're not. We're focusing our efforts on the fact that we make beverages, and I think we have plenty of horizons that have yet to be fully explored.
Well, you don't want to spread yourself too thin and offer a little bit of everything. You want to make sure that you hone in on this Pilsner, by the way. I haven't crushed a beer like this in so damn long. I was wondering where it went, and obviously I drank it all. So I definitely enjoyed it. But as we kind of end the show, we like to end it with a little bit of high note, maybe ask you some fun questions, get a little bit personal, not too personal, but enough personal. So we're going to start with Wendy. Wendy, what is your final question for Geoff and Marcy here?
Well, as I like to tell people to go on, take the cruise to Alaska, if somebody is in town for one day, where would you suggest they go and eat?
Oh my goodness.
Taku Glacier Lodge.
Yeah, very good, Marcy.
Taku Glacier Lodge. It's an incredible tour. It's a wonderful place. And the salmon that they cook is amazing. And you probably will see a bear at the same time.
And it's an incredible story about
a place that's really cool.
And a place, but it's an incredible story about an amazing pioneer. Her name was Mary Joyce, who basically did things that would blow your mind today. Anyway, so it's an experiential thing, both culinarily, visually, because the travel out there is spectacular, and then the essence of the story really epitomizes what makes the last frontier. It's people.
And that is one of the things offered on that Juneau tour thing you can win. So sign up.
It is. I didn't get to go because I chose to go to the breweries in Juneau when I was there. So I visited you guys instead.
We're not going to be self-serving like we should be.
Yeah.
Rob, what's your final question for Marcy and Geoff?
What was the last board game or card game you guys played, and who won?
Cribbage? Was it cribbage? It was cribbage, and I think he won.
Okay.
But I won the one before. So it's rematch time.
Dan, your final question for Geoff and Marcy.
All right, Marcy, I'm glad you brought up bears. I've watched plenty of shows like Alaska Highway Patrol and shows like that. How many times have you had a moose or bear come into the brewery, and what did you do about it?
Okay. Oh, let me tell you.
Well, no moose.
Okay.
No moose. We're not in moose country, so that's good.
That's one thing that's really interesting is because all of Southeast Alaska was covered by glaciers. As they receded, plant succession and animal succession has kind of been dominating. Long story short is moose are starting to come into Juneau because the glaciers have receded long enough ago that they're finding it.
They're finding plant
life.
We may get moose, but not yet. Right
so
now it's just
we worried about moose. We worried about bears. And I have to admit, I had a rifle just in case, because I was worried about the safety of my staff. It was a 30-06 with a 300 grain bullet, 2,000 feet per second type of velocity. Long story short, never had to use it. Glad. But we had a fence around the brewery, and a bear did get in the fence. And I don't know if you know what a crab trap is. It's a small opening into this wire mesh cage. The crab crawls into the only opening it can get into, but it can't get out because it's a small opening and it's hidden. Well, that's what happened to the bear. It got into the brewery fence and couldn't get out. Well, guess what we had to do? We had to go out and guide the bear out. So bears actually have a reputation. They are very dangerous when they're scared or they're habituated in an inappropriate way to human activity. Our bears are not that way.
Or if they have cubs and they're protecting.
Yeah, but they're protecting their cubs. Now, granted, we still have people that don't do a very good job of guarding their garbage, and so they get habituated to associating humans with garbage, and that's bad. But that bear was very happy that we guided it out of the brewery premise. And it was fine. And it was gone.
And Wendy, if you were in town, you may have even seen a bear in downtown because it's typical to go pub crawling downtown and run into a bear on the street. Did you run into that?
There was not when I was there. It was raining really hard.
Probably just didn't see it. You were running from spot to
It
spot.
could be.
Yep.
Well, my final question for you, if you guys, and this is the royal you, those who are listening, follow us on twitch.tv/betterondraft, kick.com, betterondraft, Facebook, YouTube, all that fun stuff. A lot of chatting going on in Twitch, including everyone talking about their first beer and what people drank as their first beer. I myself was probably a Coors Light person, even though I grew up in Michigan. Therefore, we were probably more apt to drink Molson and Labatt when we had the opportunity. But Marcy and Geoff, what were your first beers that you remember?
Mine, I remember, was Lucky Lager. You guys remember Lucky Lager? And they had the caps on the bottles with the puzzle underneath. So you pop the cap, and then you had to figure out the puzzle. It was some kind of a little puzzle thing that it was fun. It was a great drinking game.
That's totally my kind of thing.
Boy,
I
I have to say there's like a number of beers that really were iconic to me. But that's not the first beer I had. I'd have to say, oh my God, the first beers. Well, I don't really remember the first beers other than I remember my dad was in the Foreign Service. My dad was in the Foreign Service. And so I lived in Berlin, Germany in 1970 to 74, back in the Iron Curtain days. And I remember my dad being very appreciative of one of the people in the motor pool in getting our car to our house. So he gave him a case of an American domestic beer. And all the German locals didn't drink it. So that was iconic. That wasn't my first beer consumption, but it was one of those. Maybe,
he was young at that time.
Yeah,
so he was a little underage. At that
and I was underage, but at the same time, I was of beer drinking age in Germany. Jung beer they would have. But I would say the things that really impacted me were Heineken Dark. I would, as a poor college student, I would get a Heineken Dark and I would savor it. I was like, wow, the flavor. And again, this is way pre craft. No one was doing anything. New Albion had to start. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, Fritz Maytag at Anchor was getting going, but anyway, that was impactful. But one of the epiphanies I had when I was going to Siebel Institute for Brewing Science after my chemical engineering degree was Chimay Red. A friend of mine gave me a Chimay Red, and I was like, wow. It was like unbelievable. new dimensions I hadn't even thought of that existed in beer. Now, sorry, again, throwback. This is 1982. This is way before, but anyway, that's my answer. Sorry about that, Ken. I rambled on.
Don't be sorry. No, I think everyone when they think about the beer that there was their first beer, but the beer that started it all. It doesn't have to be a first beer, but it has to be as Rom Thorne posts in our YouTube page. Like for me, Killian's is the beer that makes people understand that there are other beers. So when people talk about American beer, obviously the stigma is still always Bud Molson Coors or Bud Miller Coors, not Molson. But now that we talk about American beers and American styles and the styles that we have continued to grow and progress, sure, they might laugh at us for our thick lactose milkshake IPAs, but they'll still look at us and they'll be like, wow, that's a pretty good, West Coast IPA. When we had a guy who used to own a beer store in Japan, they clamored for Stone. They wanted the freshest Stone that they could get. They love that West Coast IPA in Japan. So yeah, I think it's important to always remember a little bit of where you came from. And as you're going forward, Alaskan Brewing, where are you going forward? Where are we going to see you guys? Where can we find you? You're in 25 states. Can we order online if we're not in their states? Are you on Tavour? Where can we get your beer nationwide?
We are online through a couple of craft clearinghouses, basically. So you go into beerfinder.com or beerfinder on our website, and then look below. If you're not in the area, it says where to go. There's a couple retailers that are listed that do ship beer. I think it's Craft City is the name of one of them, and there's another one too. So there's a couple that are doing that. Hoping to get better at that, though. Right now, we're just trying to get all of our shipping and distribution channels back in play.
Perfect. That's AlaskanBeer.com. You guys are in Juneau, Alaska. Do you have any other satellite sites anywhere else, or is it just your one brewery and that's where we got to come find you and see you?
That's it.
Yeah.
Come see us. We'd love to see you up here. It's beautiful here. We're having great weather, 55 degrees and cool. It's awesome.
Hey, Dan, what's in Phoenix right now?
It's about 105.
Oh, my God.
We got a monsoon rolling in though, so that'll change.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
All right. Once again, Marcy and Geoff, thank you so much for joining us. We truly appreciate it. Go find them. Go drink their beer. Obviously, go drink one of my favorites, the Alaskan Amber, when you get a chance to go out there. And no matter what you think of your beer, we think it's better on draft. Have a good night.
Absolutely.
Cheers.
Cheers.